Hey guys, it's Raz. So I'm going to probably split our first reading into two different videos. I'll do one on plate tectonics and then I'll do the second one on soil so that they're not super long. You do have to do both for your first reading assignment though, so just plan for that. All right, so we're going to start by talking about plate tectonics because plate tectonics are really going to drive where we find resources, particularly like mining resources. It relates to the rock cycle. It's kind of the starting place of all of that. And it's important to understanding some of how resources are distributed when we start talking about rock and soil and that kind of stuff. So to start, you've probably seen this before, right? We got to talk a little bit about earth structure. We know at the core of Earth is a really dense, heavy metal, radioactive elements releasing lots and lots of heat, right? And that heat is responsible for keeping our mantle, which is the next layer, liquid. So the mantle is magma, liquid magma, that surrounds that core. Okay. And as we get further from the core, we start to cool a little because there's less heat emerging from that. So on top of the mantle, we have something called the asthenosphere. So it's a solid, flexible outer layer of mantle. Okay, so it's kind of like the edge between the mantle and the lithosphere, if you will. It's flexible, but it is solid. On top of that, we have the lithosphere, and the lithosphere is where we have our tectonic plates. So that's where we're going to focus most of this section on. Think of it as like brittle layers of rock that kind of float on top of that mantle. They don't float in circles, but yeah. And then on top of that, we have the crust, which is where we're standing, right? The very outer layer of that lithosphere. So if we look at the lithosphere, we look at the plates, those big tectonic plates that are there, we have three major types. We've got divergent plates, convergent plates, and transform fault plate boundaries. Okay. Divergent is what it sounds like. You've got plates moving apart from each other. We're going to get into these all in the next couple of slides, but when they're moving apart, oftentimes you've got a magma plume that will come up, and those are going to form a whole bunch of different features, from mid-oceanic ridges to volcanoes to rift valleys and seafloor spreading. If you want to look at a really cool image of a rift valley on land, we don't see a ton of those, but if you Google rift valley in Africa, there's a really neat one. And it literally looks like a massive, like snowboard kind of half pipe for giants maybe, but you can actually see where that spreading is occurring. It's cool. Next one is convergent plate boundaries. So like that sounds, again, plates are moving towards each other, and this will always lead to subduction, where one plate is going to be forced down beneath the other. Along these types of boundaries, we see mountains formed. We'll also see island arcs formed. We'll talk about what that means later, and earthquakes and volcanoes as well. And then the last one is transform fault plate boundaries. So this is when they're sliding past each other. This is probably what you remember learning most from other classes, because this is what contributes to earthquakes. So let's talk a little bit about how this happens. And this should look familiar. So we talked about convection when we talked about air currents, and when we talked about water currents. They impact our magma, or that mantle layer as well. So if you think about it, magma, as it's heated, is going to rise. As it rises up, it's going to cool. As it cools, we know from air it expands. As that expands, it actually will force oceanic plates apart. And that's where you see a lot of those mid-ocean ridges, like those really deep ridges that we see, are really spreading zones caused by the convection current in our mantle. As it cools and it expands, right, it starts to sink back down. It'll actually cool and form new lithospheres. So that's where we start to see new, like, continental crust form. But we also have it start to sink back down. As it sinks back down, we are going to see a subduction zone, right, where it's sinking below another plate. A lot of times we'll see, I'll talk about this in the next couple of slides, we see magma being forced up, and we can sometimes see coastal mountains and volcanoes because of this, but it's all fueled on that convection current happening below the lithosphere, or towards the lithosphere. All right. So each of these next slides talks about a specific type of boundary. So convergent boundaries are up first. We have three basic types of those. Oceanic is when you have two oceanic plates, one is subducting under the other. The plate that is more dense is always going to subduct below the less dense plate. Okay, just kind of makes sense. And when it does this, it'll sometimes force magma up to the surface. So you'll see mid-ocean volcanoes form here, and sometimes island arcs will form here. We also can sometimes see offshore trenches, right? Because as that plate subducts, it's going to form a trench. We also see convergent boundaries when it's oceanic continental. Now, oceanic plates are always more dense. They're going to subduct below the continental crust. It'll kind of melt back into the magma as it does that, and it, again, forms that convection current, right? But with these, we have a similar thing happening, right? Where as they're sort of, it is subducting, but there's still some pressure there, we'll see islands form. So the Andes, the coastal ridge of mountains, is formed from an oceanic continental convergent boundary. You also will see volcanoes pop up on these kind of things, and trenches similarly, but more importantly, tsunamis. So if these, they're not smooth either, right? If they kind of get stuck and have a large burst of energy release, they'll often form tsunamis. Last one, continental. Those are, again, two continental plates that are meeting. One is still subducted under the others, but we typically see quite a bit of continental crust get pushed upwards at the collision zone. Himalayas are a prime example of this. Those are two big continental plates that are just crashing into each other, and it makes huge mountains. All right. We also have transform fault boundaries. Now, like I mentioned, this is what we typically think of when we think of tectonic plates, because this is what we learn about because of earthquakes. Think of it like sliding two pieces of sandpaper against each other. They're rough surfaces, right? Those rough surfaces are going to get stuck on each other. As they get stuck on each other, right, pressure is going to build. Eventually, it's going to release, right? There's going to be enough pressure built up that those edges come unstuck. When that happens, you've got a large release of energy. It shakes the lithosphere. We have earthquakes. Okay, and this is a map that you may have seen before. Tectonic plates and a map of them can predict what types of things we're going to see happen around the world. So, for example, a ring of fire is one of the most, again, I think most of us know that. It's a pattern of volcanoes that occur all along the Pacific plate. And it also forms some island arcs, like the islands that are off the coast of Japan. Again, these are subduction zones. So this is a big, massive, convergent plate boundary where we have subduction. You can also look at the orange spots and you can see transform faults. Again, areas of the world where we typically see a lot of earthquakes. And then the last part here is hotspots. Now, hotspots are a stationary spot where we have hot magma that rises up into the lithosphere and kind of breaks through. Now, the kind of neat thing about hotspots, and you'll do a little bit of this for homework, is that because they're not moving, they're kind of spitting magma up in the same place. They're making islands. But as the tectonic plates move, you can actually see that they're making new islands. So think of the Hawaiian island archipelago. That is happening on a hotspot. And the larger islands kind of, we can measure the movement of those, or the speed of those tectonic plates, by looking at the size of those and also how far apart those islands are. And again, you'll do a little bit of that for homework. All right, so we're going to stop here, let you go take a breather break, come back for the soil part. That's happening next.